Shabbat Shalom, Chavirei, Gvirotai, everyone. The Parsha this week, Shalach Lecha, is set in terms of the overall biblical narrative just after the Exodus. As the survivors out of the trek from Egypt are now about to explore the route to Eretz Israel, some of them via the unlikely detour through Transjordan, as mentioned in the Haftorah. Most scholars do not accept that the Red Sea is the one mentioned in the story of the escape from bondage, but that there was another one, the Reed Sea, somewhere in Egypt, closer to the shortest route out of Egypt to Canaan. We will not go on into this geographic excursion now, but when you look at a map of the desert in Sinai or the wilderness of Paran and think of the best and shortest routes to Israel, you would not select anyone via Ammon, Moab in Transjordan, as some of our narratives suggest. Today, I'd like to engage in a bit of a challenge as to how we go about reading the Bible, especially about periods of which we know so little. Well, that's precisely the time period of the Exodus and its aftermath, or where we are today in the biblical story. Israelite origins has been one of the most fought over subjects in the last 50 years or so. When I began my PhD studies over 60 years ago, believe it or not, it was fairly commonplace for scholars to accept the historicity of the patriarchs and the narratives about them, and to date them around 1900 BCE at the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, or approximately 4,000 years ago. Today, only the most fundamentalist Christian scholars would accept such an assessment. But in synagogue discussions and Q&A, we often treat the matriarchs and the patriarchs as real-life historical figures. But hear this. The first extra-biblical reference to Israel is the Merneptah Stela, dated circa 1220 before the Common Era. As for the presence of any proto-Israelites in Egypt before that, in the late Ramesside period, Ramses II, the presumed Pharaoh of the Exodus, according to Gary Rensburg, and I'll mention him a couple of times since so many of you were traveling with him and Rabbi Graber as Bethel's Guide to Egypt last year. Gary maintains that the reference in the Merneptah Stela refers to Northwest Semites, or what I would call Proto-Israelites, at the end of the 12th century. He's much lower than most people. Gary's dating the Exodus to the late 12th century. And this is at odds, I add, with most people who would date it much earlier. Rensburg, in order to do this, is very much influenced by the early dating of the Song of the Sea to circa 1125, proposed many years ago by one of my teachers, beloved teachers at Harvard, Frank Moorcross. The oldest text would be, the second oldest text in the Bible would be Joshua 5, or the Song of Deborah, another Harvard proposition that has stood the test of time and gives credence to the idea that whatever happened in Egypt to the corvée laborers, their release and return to Canaan had a profound impact on their group identity and nurtured what I would call a primitive view that they had received inspiration and assistance from a higher authority. But how seriously and literally can we take the story? Do we know anything about them apart from the Exodus narrative? No. Do we know anything about those who did not go down to Egypt, who stayed in the land? All those Northwest Semitic speakers, although the earliest Genesis narratives assume that among the earliest were Eastern Semites, i.e., you know who that is, Abraham, who came from Mesopotamia in the biblical story. What do we know about the period and place of today's Parsha? Not a heck of a lot. Though one excavation, or Parsha and Haftorah, though one excavation in Jordan, Tel El Umeiri, has surprisingly found and identified a house type that was common in Egypt at this time and adopted widely in Israel in the Iron Age, the four-room house, usually associated with a kalarim storage jar. For some of you, this might suggest material evidence for at least some escapees coming from the northern route via Transjordan. But in Transjordan, at Tel El Umeiri, right, there was a small temple next to these houses with a statue of Asherah found in it. But in accepting general aspects of the biblical story, namely sojourn, corvée labor, escape, and liberation, together with the earliest poetic versions of such recollections of memory, we have the makings of a story of origin that brought people with a shared experience and language together. But it was only much later, 400 or 500 years at minimum, when a fuller narrative emerged, no doubt influenced by a familiar Egyptian story or stories and narratives that circulated widely in the Iron Age. For example, the tale of Sinewy, a story of a man fleeing from Egypt and returning, reflecting themes of exile and homecoming. The theme of liberation and freedom, when shared with other local Canaanites or Northwest Semitic-speaking people who were suffering under the heavy burden of city-state rulers in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, clearly must have resonated. This happened at the end of the Late Bronze Age, 1500 to 1200, and the Iron Age, 1200 to 586 BCE, but most probably in the Iron Age between 1200 and 586, the end of the First Temple. So what happens when we admit that what we read in the Bible ain't necessarily so? To quote a phrase from Ira Gershwin, what happens to our understanding of the biblical story when we stand back from literal reading as if it was an eyewitness account? In reading the Parsha, I turned to Carol a few moments ago. They're coming out of Egypt with all these bulls and rams and bread and offerings, you know. Just think about that. If you place it in the biblical story according to its chronology, not likely at all. I'm not asking you to become biblical scholars, but as presumably liberal conservative Jews, I would hope you would have a serious obligation to have a sense of how the Bible was written and when and how it was organized as a priceless collection of overlapping and often conflicting voices, not to mention that reading the Bible as straight history and not historiography creates all sorts of exegetical problems. In my estimation, the more we know about the text, the better off we are in respect to knowing what the original authors and editors intended. Early Israel, let's say circa 1200 BCE, or a bit later, after leaving Egypt and heading to Canaan by various routes, did not yet have a developed set of beliefs, let alone a clearly articulated view of monotheism. From the Song of the Sea, Mi kamocha ba'elim, who is like you among the other gods? No monotheism there. Exodus 15, verse 11. In meeting up with other suffering peoples, who, like most Proto-Israelites, spoke a kind of Paleo-Hebrew, once removed from servitude in Canaan, they headed for the hills, highlands of Judea and Samaria, where they could gain a more permanent measure of security and freedom. It was there that they established an egalitarian ethos of living and established the mores and living standards that became articulated, embedded in the Bible. The book of Joshua, however, portrays a unified group of Israelites conquering the land from hostile Canaanites, and you met some of the worst enemies this morning in our text. But excavations from Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer, Jericho, Ai, and many others do not depict any widespread destruction or debris accumulations that would suggest a conquest, let alone that fighting took place. However, Rensburg notes that at Lachish, Stratum 6 in Judah, there is an Egyptian destruction circa 1150 BCE, which supports at least a partial battle narrative in one spot. Hence, a theory of gradual infiltration over several centuries, at least, took hold also about 50 years ago or so, that proposed that the new peoples who settled the land of Israel settled it peacefully as powerful city-states crumbled here and there. During this period, around 200 years, these various groups began to coalesce and ultimately joined hands to establish a monarchy around 1000. Though most scholars today would push that, most Israeli scholars and many American scholars would push that down to the 9th century, also disrupting the whole biblical chronology. And precisely from this period comes the first piece of written evidence from the land of Israel in Paleo-Hebrew, a script derived from the Phoenician alphabet circa 1000. Hebrew square script was only adopted much later in the Babylonian period. This artifact is known as the Gezer calendar, a limestone tablet detailing an annual cycle of agricultural activities from around 1000 BCE. Though the Bible, 1 Kings 9:16, says that Joshua defeated the king of Gezer, the first indication of Israelite habitation at the site of Gezer is only from the time of Solomon, mid-10th century. And Joshua would have lived, according to the biblical chronology, 200 or 300 years before that, if we associate this parsha with the time of Joshua. So you can see we have a problem. If we read the story of the spies searching the land literally, an alternative version attributes the spying of the land with Joshua himself in the Haftarah. Joshua 2, verses 1 to 24. So in thinking about early Israel after the Exodus, scholars today posit that it took a good deal of time for early Israel, even Rensburg's chronology, a bit less, a century and a half in his chronology, but in most reconstructions, at least 300 years or so, until the monarchy was established. How large and influential was that monarchy is still an open question. And if there was some form of earlier rule that preceded it, as suggested in the 12-tribe affiliation, known as the Amphictyony, what happened under that organization? But our larger biblical narrative of the Pentateuch assumes so much more. Abraham, the first Hebrew, started a new religion. Moses received a new code of law with a revelation at Sinai. And he, along with others, brought new religion to Canaan after the Exodus and period of wandering. And we have nothing in Paleo-Hebrew till the 10th century. Moses was doing all sorts of things in our Parsha today. No serious scholar of biblical history today would say that parts of the Pentateuch were written in the Bronze Age or the early Iron Age, or that the biblical story as it has been received was known or conceived at this early stage of development of the people of Israel. The earliest preserved text of the Bible was mentioned 2 weeks ago by Rabbi Posner. It's the priestly blessing, number 6:22 to 27, which was discovered on an amulet dated to the late 7th century BCE, precisely the time we read about King Josiah discovering the book of law in the book believed to be the book of the law stated in Deuteronomy 2 Kings 22:8, and believed to be the book of Deuteronomy. Now we are talking about 800 years between the so-called Sinai event, celebrated on Shavuot, and the first written words of the Bible to be discovered in Paleo-Hebrew. Taking modern biblical scholarship of the Bible sounds a bit challenging and complicated, but it also forces us to at least consider that what led to the writing down of the Bible and its editing was a more wondrous achievement that defined a unique culture in a short period of time. That time is the Iron Age, and probably Iron II Age, the First Temple period. That's when creative juices of Israelites were running most deeply. 8th to 6th century, I'd even push it into those 2 centuries more. When the unedited version of the Pentateuch, the Chumash, was coming into being. JEPD, according to many scholars, the edited version and former prophets coming together only in the exile and after, engendering what I call the primary history from Abraham to the exile. So where does that leave us? Was Moses an historical figure or a creation of a later period? If there was no Moses, I would say he's so important in our biblical narrative that he had to be created for a larger story to work. It's a brilliant and inspiring story that has propelled the Jewish people for thousands of years. Not knowing precisely how or when Israelite religion or Yahwism originated, according to the biblical chronology, can actually enhance our appreciation of how much of the Bible came to fruition in the Bible, in the Iron Age. There hardly could have been a Torah or law scroll presented to Moses at Sinai, since there was no Israel at that time, no Hebrew language, no alphabet. But understanding how such a view emerged and helped Jewish spirituality and belief over time brings us right to the heart of how and when Israelite literacy and creativity emerged. And that's a very good place to be. So let's welcome scientific and critical assessments and put them up against the more traditional rabbinic interpretations. I think that the biblical authors and their genius will always come out first. For what we have in the Bible is one of the greatest collections of high literature in the history of humanity. The conditions that led to its writing down should not be overlooked in favor of accepting uncritically the self-perpetuating chronology of the Bible itself, which has nothing to do with history as we know it. What women accomplished in maintaining a household in the Iron Age in the rough hill country is nothing short of spectacular, which we learn from material culture, but is reflected in biblical law and many stories. Patriarchy is a creation of the later rabbis. Libertarian ideas emerged in the small rural settings in which Israelite nation took shape. The emergence of prophecy elevated ethical and moral issues to the center of Israelite culture beginning in the 8th century. And the idea of freedom, so eloquently attached to the memory of just a few, echoed so deeply that it became attached to the universal messianic idea. Its first iteration was in the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, where it is attached to the settlement of the land. A few months ago, the well-known scholar of New Testament at Chapel Hill, Bart Ehrman, published an op-ed in the New York Times in which he claimed that Jesus Christ was the first person in history to equate love of one's neighbor, Leviticus 19, the golden rule, to love all humanity. He went on to say that in Israelite society and the Hebrew Bible, neighbor, stranger, or fellow Israelite always meant fellow Jew or fellow Israelite. When I contacted him and challenged his reading of the text, I reminded him that in Israel at that time there were plenty of others and numerous disaffected words, and numerous different words for stranger, non-Israelite, ger, goy, etc. To the best of my knowledge, no one called him on this egregious misreading of the biblical text. In a number of emails and talks with him, I challenged his interpretation, was totally unsuccessful in budging him from his conviction that loving the stranger meant loving your neighbor and fellow Israelite only. I tell this story in conclusion because as we become more and more sophisticated and informed readers of the biblical text, we have a responsibility to challenge those who would take away from us what is rightfully our own very sacred and beloved tradition. We also are obliged to challenge ourselves as we struggle to uncover the original meaning and context of the text. Sometimes it may seem as if knowing too much can get in the way. But among the many reasons the Bible has survived so long is because generations have spent so much effort trying to understand the Peshat, the simple meaning of the text, then and today and in our own time. Shabbat Shalom, go Knicks.